Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous-led conservation are both crucial for Canada's future, but they're also widely misunderstood. Tansei, Michelle Cyca, nitty soon. My name is Michelle Cyca, and I'm a senior editor at The Narwhal. In this video, I'll start by defining two key terms, Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous-led conservation. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, what Indigenous sovereignty really means, how it's connected to Canada's environmental and economic future, and what it has to do with Indigenous-led conservation. Throughout, we'll share some links to Narwhal stories that'll help you understand these topics better. Okay, here's what you need to know. Indigenous-led conservation refers to environmental protections and stewardship that's led by Indigenous nations on their lands and waters. Often these initiatives have federal, provincial, or territorial governments as partners, and some involve private organizations or donors as well. You might hear different terms like IPCA, that's an Indigenous protected and conserved area, project finance for permanence, or tribal park. There are lots of different ways that these protected areas can be set up, but the key is that they're led by Indigenous nations and they're rooted in their laws and governance. In 2022, Canada signed an international pledge to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030, with the goal of protecting a wide variety of plants and animals, combating climate change, and creating a sustainable economy. That work requires the partnerships of Indigenous nations who are already living in many of these areas that Canada seeks to protect. Increasingly, there's an understanding that Indigenous traditional knowledge and practices are key to protecting and restoring environments, like prescribed burns, which mitigate wildfire risk.
Indigenous people are the stewards of most of Canada's intact ecosystems, like Seal River, a watershed in northern Manitoba stewarded by Dene and Cree peoples. These are havens for biodiversity.
Or the Hudson Bay and James Bay lowlands in northern Ontario. Omashkego call these peatlands the breathing lands, the lungs of the world. They store an enormous amount of carbon, helping to regulate the global climate. We wrote about this on our website. Check it out. Lately, you've probably heard a lot about sovereignty. Even before Donald Trump got into office, he started talking about making Canada the 51st state, and he wasn't joking. That's one reason why our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, campaigned on strengthening Canada's sovereignty, in part through investing in economic development and military power. Both are key to ensuring Canada's not so reliant on the US. But both require engaging with Indigenous nations and the rights of Indigenous people. Federal and provincial governments are working to speed up development and in some cases crafting new laws to help push projects through. But that's sparked concern among First Nations whose rights and territories could be impacted. And it's not clear how these two things, speeding projects up and upholding the rights of Indigenous people, can be reconciled. But more on that in a minute. Carney's also talked about the other big threat to Canada, the climate crisis, and the need to protect our biodiversity and natural resources in the face of a rapidly warming planet. Indigenous-led conservation is a huge part of that work too, and it's rooted in Indigenous sovereignty. Here's the deal with Indigenous rights. In 1973, a court case known as Calder found that Indigenous title exists and preceded Confederation. It predates Canada. This was huge. At the time, Pierre Trudeau apparently said of First Nations, "Maybe you have more rights than we thought you did." In 1982, Section 35 of the Constitution affirmed the existence of Aboriginal rights. This is important. Indigenous rights aren't about being nice or about sharing. They're a legally binding part of Canada's Constitution. But the Constitution is not very clear about what exactly Aboriginal rights mean, so subsequent court cases have essentially tested what Indigenous rights entail. More than 20 years later, the Supreme Court case known as Delgamuukw clarified that Aboriginal rights apply to the land itself, not just activities that happen on the land, like hunting or fishing. So that means whenever the government wants to do something that affects Indigenous land, like giving a company permission to build a mine or a pipeline, they have to consult with the Indigenous nations that are affected. Because most Indigenous nations in British Columbia never ceded the title to their lands through treaties, a lot of important cases have happened in BC. Delgamuukw was a case brought by the Gitxsan Nation, and it was when the government really started to understand that consultation was an important part of industry and development. In 2014, the Chilcotin Nation won a case against BC for undertaking forestry without consent.
Consultation is required by law, but under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, or UNDRIP, so is free, prior, and informed consent.
That means that Indigenous nations can't be coerced into consenting to a project, that they have to be informed before a project gets started with enough time to consider the pros and cons, the risks and benefits, and they have to be informed in comprehensive and culturally appropriate ways. If any aspects of the process are missed or not done properly, then Indigenous nations can and have pushed back through the courts. numerous court cases have been decided in favor of Indigenous nations. As a result, the provincial and federal governments have started to take cooperation and partnership seriously. Since respecting Aboriginal title, Indigenous rights, and the duty to consult is a lot easier and faster than losing in court over and over again. Maybe you've heard about Bill 5 in Ontario or Bill 15 in BC. Both give the provinces sweeping powers to speed up development, but both have been met with concern by First Nations because it's not clear how these bills would affect the duty to consult. That's because the consultation process, which involves all First Nations whose territories might be affected, can't really be sped up or swept aside. That's one reason why BC and Ontario both need to figure out the implications of their respective bills. Because if they fail to consult adequately with First Nations, which means getting free, prior, and informed consent, then those First Nations can fight them in court. And court battles, no matter the outcome, cost a lot of money and slow everything down. Sovereignty means that Indigenous nations get to be full partners in any industry or development on their homelands, if they agree to it. Because it also means stewarding their homelands in other ways if they see fit. Some people say that Indigenous rights are racist because they give one racial group special privileges over another. But Indigenous rights aren't based on race. They're based on membership in a specific Indigenous nation, based on that nation's territories and the agreements that it makes with the Crown. So as an Indigenous person whose homeland is in the prairies, I have no harvesting or fishing rights here in BC. I have no claim to places like Haida Gwaii or Musqueam. Just like Canadians have particular rights in Canada, like the right to vote or the right to leave or enter the country, Indigenous people have specific rights that flow from their membership in their Indigenous nation as well. Indigenous conservation is also a reflection of Indigenous sovereignty. And while many Indigenous nations are protecting their lands in partnership with federal and provincial governments, some Indigenous nations are taking matters into their own hands, like Kitasoo Hayhays, a BC First Nations which declared protections over their marine territory in 2023, or Kwikwasutamook Hakwamish on Vancouver Island. These nations aren't waiting for provincial or federal governments to recognize that their territories need protections. They're exercising their rights. But Indigenous-led conservation is good for everyone, too. A 2016 study in the Northwest Territories found that for every $1 invested in Indigenous guardians, the people on the ground monitoring and caring for the land, it yields $2.50 in economic, social, and environmental benefits. And as Canada is facing a crisis of declining biodiversity, Indigenous-led conservation can help to protect our ecosystems and reverse that decline. Indigenous nations are already stewarding most of the biodiversity on Earth. Respecting the rights of Indigenous people to care for the lands and waters where they already live is an effective and economical solution for protecting vulnerable species, responding to oil spills, mitigating wildfires, monitoring climate change impacts, and more. Some worry that Indigenous-led conservation can mean losing access to nature, but each Indigenous protected and conserved area has unique guidelines for economic and recreational activity. In Tloquet tribal parks, for instance, curtailing logging has allowed more visitors to experience the ancient forests and beautiful beaches, and ensured that the First Nations can protect their cultural relationship to the trees. Protecting these ecosystems from risks like overfishing, clear-cut logging, and rampant tourism is good for all of us, now and in the future. So, Indigenous-led conservation is key to protecting the environment, and Indigenous rights have been recognized time and again by Canadian courts. And one way that Indigenous nations exercise their rights is by caring for their environments. But there's still a lot of challenges. One is that industry often collides with Indigenous rights, particularly when the nations don't consent to a project or say that consultation was inadequate. Right now in BC, the Hatzel First Nation is taking the province to court for approving an expansion of a tailings pond at the Mount Poly mine without seeking consent. There's also the matter of backlash. Not everyone wants to see Indigenous rights recognized, particularly rights to land. In BC, proposed changes to the Land Act that would have aligned it with the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People Act were scrapped after fears that changes would erode private property rights, curtail access to parks, and destroy industry. Right now in BC, some provincial parks are closing temporarily to visitors to allow the rights-holding First Nations of those areas to engage in harvesting and cultural activities. This has become a highly politicized issue, one we'll be covering in more detail over the summer. We're diving into some other issues around Indigenous protections, like Pipiu, or Joffrey Lakes, which is a provincial park in BC that's being temporarily closed at several intervals throughout the summer so that the two rights-holding First Nations who share the territory can practice cultural activities and harvesting on the land. Do you have questions about Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous-led conservation, Bill 5, Bill 15, and what it all means? We're putting together an explainer, so you can add your questions as comments in this video, and we'll do our best to answer them in an upcoming story. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. We're new to this platform and your support's greatly appreciated. And if you want more from the Narwhal, all of our stories are free on our site. We're a nonprofit, so if you'd like to support our work, there's a link to donate in the description of this video. And finally, if you want to see our source notes for this video, they're all available on our website. We strive to be transparent and ethical in our reporting, and we're always open to your feedback.